Okay, they inform that it's in progress. Well, so here we are again, the closing, the finissage of your beautiful exhibition. We are here, and we have Maria Eduarda, that it's here with us, and so you're going to talk a bit about your work and about things that you want. So once again, thank you, and well, let's start.
Okay.
Very well.
So
bye.
First of all, I'd like to thank you guys for the introduction, for the invitation, and I'm honored to be here talking with Agata about her astonishing work. So let's begin. I prepared some questions, and I will be reading them because I have a really hard time switching languages. So I'm going to start. We are gathered here to further our conversation on the short and growing, which has been the main subject of this exhibition that ends today. Specifically, I would like to start our discussion with the act of seeing and looking at objects. Just a short note I'd like to share with you guys is that here in Portugal, we actually start to study the history of art with the objects that were found in various ceremonies, such as weapons and pottery, at least 15,000 years ago. And this, I think, summarizes the importance of our species interaction with objects. However, deeply in this context, we have to have in mind that our environment indeed affects the production and aesthetic relationship we build with objects, as well as our perception towards life itself. So, Agata, my first question for you is, how did your relationship with objects begin?
Well, thank you very much for all your questions in advance, and thank you very much also everyone for coming. And for the question, I think the relationship with objects, it started pretty much intuitively, so to speak, because the first work I did with photography and using things, which were again mannequins and prostheses and so on, it was a family album. So I basically was restaging family pictures that it's not maybe evident because we use family photography to depict people, not necessarily the dolls. But somehow it felt more natural to make the recreation of family photography with things, because in the end of the day, they are dummies and they somehow allowed to create more readable depiction how family photography as a vernacular photography can be read as unconsciously collectively created type of depiction, and how we repeat again unconsciously very often certain patterns, and how in the end of the day family photography can tell us a lot about the hierarchies, the sort of stratum within the families, and also that refers also to gender, for example, and to age. And later on, I quite naturally continued to work with things. At a certain point, the question that you asked appears: why am I doing this exactly? And I think that all of the things I'm working with, they somehow fall into the criteria of fetishes. And talking about fetishes, we have to understand this is a very broad definition that has a long history. So initially it was used in 18th century, I would say 17th, 18th century, to in the context of religion and ethnography. It's a very much Western Occidental definition that was used to name non-Christian African silhouettes, statuettes that were the statuettes of votive statuettes and statuettes of cult. So it was a very negative term that was indicative towards other cultures, probably less advanced intellectually, to other religion and so on. Another definition of fetish was applied by Karl Marx in the context of capitalism. So the fetish would be for him a product that we in the capitalist context value way too much. We pay for it with our time, with our money, with our labor. But in the end of the day, it's just a thing. It's not even worth very often what we pay for. So it's a kind of a contemporary religious almost fetish for capitalism. And the latest definition would be pantosexuality. It was proposed by Alfred Binet, by Freud. So here again, it was negative because fetishism was defined as this kind of a sickness. Because again, to be fetishist, it means to be interested or erotically appealed or aroused by, for example, human body parts. So only a leg, only a feet. We do not value the human being and the whole posture as it should be. We're attracted to something that's just very prosthetic. So all of those definitions always refer to something that is kind of worse, that is strange, repulsive, and so on. And I think that the objects that I'm working with, they pretty much represent and they are close to all those definitions, either culturally speaking or in terms of economical products, because even the things that you see in the photographs, they're very expensive commodities. They are not just medical bizarre toys, but there's a whole industry for manufacturing those. Or, of course, when it comes to sexuality, the other works that are not exhibited here, they pretty much refer to sexual fetishes. So I think from that, I would just continuously dig in the problem of the objects. And I also think that those things are as bizarre and sometimes ugly, kind of wrong they can be. They exercise ourselves. You need to kind of have to escape your zone of comfort to approach them and to see them as cultural artifacts rather than just silly, bizarre, ugly, strange products that evoke from God knows where. And I would say that once you go on the other side, you start to, and you observe how they're being produced, why, how much it costs, their evolution, their history, you start to dig in and you start to see them as potential tools that are very much mirroring way more serious and crucial problems. So speaking, for example, about medical education, medical props, they pretty much depict how a human body is being treated and operated on, how the whole organization of healthcare system, which become now increasingly institutionalized, is being organized around the human body, and how this system is pretty much responsible for creating the definition of a medical body, very often in opposition to a healthy body, which is also a social and cultural definition, I would say. So I think that's my attitude to those seemingly bizarre things.
Okay, perfect. And I was going to ask you about how your artistic case developed in this context, but I think it's already explained. But let's go on to the next question. It's on the same topic. I think that in the 21st century, with the widespread use of internet, access to knowledge and content has become more feasible for minority and marginalized groups. Movement that brought to the surface many histories that vanished under the carpet of fact. This was the case of many surrealist feminine female artists that began to be rediscovered by artists. This has also led to the rediscovery of many histories that were previously overlooked. One such example is the resurgence of interest in female surrealist artists such as Eduarda Wendhausen, UMBIGO, and collaborator, with the thoughts of non-binary and genderless, among many others. These artists were at the forefront of exploring the female gaze and objectification of the female body. How have these female surrealists inspired you?
Well, I think again, I wouldn't say that it's exactly an inspiration. I would say that's more a dialoguing that very often comes by surprise. Because what you said, that there's a resurfacing of those artists, which is very much true. Because if we think about Claude Cahun, who has been pretty much rediscovered, she was a figure very present in the surrealist scene. But after the Second World War, when she died in the 40s, you would have years before she would be again put on the pedestal and her work in the museums. It was in fact Gillian Waring, who is fantastic, Turner Prize nominee, British artist, and she also works with the silicone masks and the body parts. She would have an extensive project that would be a dialogue between her and Claude Cahun, and this is how Claude Cahun resurfaced. And that happened, well, maybe 10 years ago. Same thing, for example, with, let's say, April Dawn Allison, who wasn't really a self-defining artist. It was a man who was an ex-Marine, ex-soldier in the United States, who was based in San Francisco. And after he quitted his military profession, he started to be a photographer. And he would have a little studio, but after he would be done with his daily job, he would be a cross-dresser, and no one would know. His family wouldn't know, his closest environment wouldn't know. He would dress as a woman in a clandestine, secret way, and he would take pictures. And because of the fact that he had a pre-existing photographic practice, those Polaroids were absolutely fantastic. He produced thousands of pictures that were discovered after he died by accident, and they were taken good care because they were introduced to one of the curators of San Francisco Museum of Contemporary Art, modern art, I'm sorry. And this is how, again, what he did resurfaced. So we've got lots of artists who were shunned and who were shifted out of sight, because obviously coming out as a crossdresser in the 60s, 70s might not have been the easiest way. It's not easy choice to do even nowadays. Claude Cahun, well, he was, they were breaking the gender codes, and Claude Cahun was not very accepted in the surrealist circle. Her work would be appreciated, but Claude Cahun as a personality that she would have a shaved head, she wouldn't conform, she, he, them, because she, them would be changing. It wasn't a personality that was approved in the community. So again, Cahun was shunned. So I would not be really having those examples very much in front of myself when I would be working, and very often they would resurface, or I would get to know them because I was researching while doing my works. And I think this happens very often when we work with such subjects. And I'm very happy to see that. Well, again, working right now with means, with materials, with objects that were non-existent in the past. Obviously, my practice is going to be different. It might repeat some strategies, but it will be different to the artists from the past. And I'm happy to see there's a dialogue between this.
I would like to go back to the question of the matter of the fetish, about the concept of dolls and silicone molds to you. Can you talk a little bit more about it?
Well, I think they really facilitate a lot, telling about very private issues versus the public issues, because I think in particular that the silicone molds, I tend to work a lot with silicone objects because on the sculptural point of view, they provide very realistic effects. So when we photograph them, when we film them or animate them in stop motion, on the image, they seem to be perfectly in between a body and an object, up to the moment that sometimes watching them, we are not exactly sure if we're watching a person or a thing, basically. And I think what I'm trying to do is to use that space of uncertainty to show how body becomes sort of a battleground, actually, for negotiating how we tend to feel about ourselves, how intimate and organic certain experiences can be, versus how our proper body is being rendered politically and publicly, and how that image is being imposed on the body, which is pretty much objectifying, obviously.
That's quite like institutionalized here. Our bodies transforming into with the past of the years. Like our bodies serve just as mere years or just as mere products of the system.
Well, yes, I think that happens beyond the institutions per se. I think it happens generally globally in the context of economy, because speaking about the body, this is the body that produces and that reproduces other bodies that can produce more. So this is the body that performs labor. This is the body that consumes. So this is the body which needs and desires and which product can be commodified. Body itself can be commodified. It's a perfect commodity. So regulating the labor of the body, obviously, and the products of the body itself, I think this is a fantastic economic strategy. And sadly, it's a very cynical view, obviously, but this is very much objectifying. And we see it very well when we think about non-paid labor, when we think about underpaid labor, when we go out traditionally to the figure of a woman, of a wife who wouldn't go to job, but she would be a housemaid, basically. She would be responsible for a household. She would be housekeeper, she wouldn't be paid for that. The man who would traditionally go to work, he would be paid for his work, but her performance would not be considered as work. Similarly, it happens very often, sadly, with immigrants that very often do not have, legally speaking, the tools to negotiate their position, and they end up in being a very unfavorable situation when it comes to work, underpaid, bad conditions, and so on. But this comes from the fact that, well, the profit needs to be there. So this is one of the ways, which is completely not moral and unsafe and unfair.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. I want to go further in the sense of the reproductive loss. And I prepared a few examples for you guys to talk about. A few years ago, as you may know, the context in which women in Poland could legally and safely have abortions changed. This was one of the contexts that triggered growing rights argument. And previously, the law allowed for voluntary termination of pregnancy in cases of fetal malformation, but this was overturned by the Polish Constitutional Law Court in 2021. The ruling sparked widespread protests across the country, with thousands of women taken to the streets to voice their opposition. Under the new law, abortions were only legal in cases of rape, incest, or when the mother's health is at risk. The court's decision was based on conservative Catholic principles in Poland, which has the most restrictive abortion laws in Europe and has been condemned by the European Parliament. Unfortunately, this is a situation faced by many women in countries outside of Europe and North America. For example, I'm Brazilian, and I'm going to share this example. Abortion is only legal in cases of rape, risk of the mother's life, or an assembly of the fetus. Otherwise, it's considered a crime. These harsh reproductive laws can be traced back to a Christian culture that dates back to the colonial period, until this persists in the country despite its status as a secular state. However, here in Portugal, the situation is much more respectful of women's decision-making authorities over their own bodies. Although its law became legal in 2007, abortion is available free of charge regardless of the reasons behind it. This decision led to an immediate decrease in deaths and caused by unsafe abortions. How do you think the national politics can play a critical role in improving conditions of women's life in general?
Well, I would say that it affects that tremendously, obviously, and sometimes not taking certain steps on the level of legislation can do more than taking certain steps. So in this case, of course, not banning abortion would be pretty much a favorable choice of the Polish government. The thing that seems to me evident is that whether women need abortion, they will get it one way or another, whether risking their health or their lives. The history of banning of abortion shows it clearly. There is no other way. So this ban, I think, and national policies that targets reproductive rights, they have a very harmful effect, twofold. I would say the first one, because they cut off the access to healthcare, which, for example, in Poland, it is very visible because we've got the growing number of women who die, simply speaking, because the abortion, for example, is not being provided on time, the sepsis develops, so the whole body gets intoxicated, and we've got a death case. So, and this is why we've got the movement Ani jedna więcej, which in Polish means not one more. And we've got a list, sadly, augmenting with names of women who simply were not provided help on time. So this is one thing. Another thing is that abortion ban gives a premise to the whole machine, socioculture machine of stigmatization, which can be present very much in the very private, intimate circles such as family, friends, but also in the institutionalized circles such as hospital and medical doctors' cabinets, which normally both of those spheres should be the places of safety, where we get support, good advice, help, but no. And sadly, knowing that being pregnant willingly, desirably, in case something, whatever happened, you cannot really feel safe anywhere. That starts a kind of collective anxiety that I feel very clearly as a Polish citizen. I'm not living in Poland anymore, and nevertheless, I did confront with this ban myself, and I observed lots of my friends also confronting it, and that sentiment of bizarre anxiety that was not there in that context before, it is very, very present. I think this is also why this particular subject and that the presence of fear, in fact, makes it sadly, but a subject that can be approached, for example, with horror film, which as a type of a movie making deals precisely with anxieties and with fear.
Yeah. In my text that I wrote for UMBIGO, I was tracing back the origins of the female and mostly feminist approach on horror movies and object art that is really linked to the opposition of the aestheticization. I don't know how to say this word properly.
Aestheticization.
Yeah, exactly. And of the female body, and to be clean and shapes and without any flaws. And that object art is really the opposite of all that. I have a really good example if you guys want to look further. It's called Ligia Faith and Ligia Clark, two of the most famous Brazilian artists that really go into this object art phase. So I have one last question for you, Agata, and thank you very much for your time. How do you view the relationship between horror movies and object art as a means of addressing the institutional violence against the female body?
Well, I think I'm not working with object the way how maybe Julia Kristeva, who coins this definition, would probably like to, because I'm not working with horror, for example, the way how we are maybe used to, because speaking about horror, we tend to think about slasher, we tend to think about revenge films, so there's obviously lots of physical violence, blood, and so on. Here, I think the terror and horror comes from a very aseptic and very institutionalized, artificial, like prosthetic reality, such as in growing. I think it's something that has been long present, and talking about horror films and talking about pregnancy, if we look closely at the moments when motive of gestation and pregnancy would evoke in horror films, we can see that in the history we had different moments when we would have sudden surge of production of those very particular films. And the first wave of a pregnancy horror films, so to speak, would happen after 1968. So we are talking here, of course, about Rosemary Baby by Polanski. Then later in the 70s, there would be some sort of a strange surge of this kind of production. So we had Eraserhead, that is not strictly about pregnancy, but it is about parenthood by David Lynch. We've got It's Alive by Larry Cohen. We've got all these bizarre films, The Brood by Cronenberg, all the group of these films that suddenly deal with childhood, family, pregnancy, gestation. And if you look closely, what happened before? Well, before, first of all, we've got second wave of feminism, and we've got the changes in all parts of daily life, in legislation when it comes to the divorce law, for example. We've got the whole huge discussion about female rights. We've got discussion about labor and gender segregation labor rights. We've got changes in the way how women are being treated, or we're being more outspoken about medicalization of pregnancy, meaning how we deal with delivery in the hospitals that might not be necessarily that well designed for everyone. all that starts to steer. So of course, filmmaking as a matter, it always is very susceptible to the surrounding reality. So it builds on that. So it extracts, and obviously this is a time of huge changes, social, cultural, mental. So it comes with fear, with anxiety, what will happen after. So this is why in the 60s, 70s, we've got that. Upon to this, until 68 in the United States, there was a motion picture production code, which was a censorship present since 1930s. And it was quite strict. It was obligatory for all the filmmakers in the States, which would have about 25, I think, subjects that were not allowed to show on screen. And 11 of them were radically prohibited. And one of them was pregnancy. You wouldn't say pregnancy in the film, you would say baby, or you wouldn't ever show it, even silhouette.
That's why it's Rosemary's Baby.
Well, in a way, yes, because Rosemary Baby happened just after, so all of a sudden you can show the scene of childbirth, for example. You can show the scene what happens after. You can get the camera into a scene where you've got interaction with a doctor. So that wasn't very present before for the obvious reasons. And then again in the 2014, 16, and up to now, we've got again, all of a sudden, we've got more films, this time made more by women than men, because I mentioned Larry Cohen, Cronenberg, Polanski. These are all male directors, which also come from the fact that, well, it's a very masculinized industry, film industry. And when I was a student at the film school in Łódź in Poland, which was actually also a school of Polanski, all my professors were men, apart from maybe a professor from film editing, because that was a very focused, very hand and very eye connecting work. So that was good for women, right? So then you would have female professors. And then we had more of those films such as Revenge, recently Anything for Jackson, films that again are about pregnancy, gestation, Babadook, about the family issues and family trauma. And I think it also comes from somewhere. I would say the second wave of those pregnancy, gestation, family-related horror films also come from the fact that we've got the steering national policies and the global discussion about reproductive rights. And again, some sort of a struggle between genders that is again on the table.
That Anna spoke of. Let me just say okay. So this was my questions I had to you. If you want of you guys have something to ask Agata. No. Okay. Thank you very much for your time, Agata. I really love
Thank you very much for the questions and for the meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Agata. It was an amazing exhibition, and it's we have several sessions of talks with you. Always different, always good, and it's really a pleasure to work with you and showing and sharing your work here. When we so
Well, my pleasure.
okay. Is nobody?
So thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you again, and a nice.
Have a nice rest of exhibition and a nice, beautiful evening.
Bye.